3 different people, independently, in the comments of the Yarrick video, all said the same name. Not prompted, not responding to each other, just Ciaphas Cain. And the more I looked into it, the worse it got. Not worse as in the theory collapses, worse as in it holds together uncomfortably well. Better in some ways than Yarrick's case, because Yarrick gives you one data point and Cain gives you the second one, and the second one is where a pattern becomes an argument. The Yarrick case suggests that WAAAGH-field immortality is possible. The Cain case suggests it's automatic. The subject doesn't need to agree to it, doesn't need to perform for it, doesn't need to know it's happening. Cain spent his entire career trying to be unremarkable, and the best available evidence suggests that the Orks have been making him cosmically unkillable anyway, against his stated wishes, for over a century. That is the thesis. We build the foundation first. Sebastian Yarrick, Old Baali, Commissar, Officio Prefectus. The man from Taos III who learned the Ork language as a young officer because he believed that understanding the enemy's psychology was tactically necessary. By the Second War for Armageddon in 941 M41, he had spent decades fighting alongside Armageddon's planetary defense forces. He was scheduled to retire the day the Orks landed. He was instead assigned to Hades Hive, not as a reward. The planetary overlord, Hermann von Straub, sent him there as punishment for circumventing von Straub's authority. Yarrick had ordered Armageddon's astropaths to call for reinforcements without von Straub's sanction, because Yarrick had assessed WAAAGH-field as more cunning and dangerous than any Ork warlord previously encountered. He was correct. Von Straub wasn't the kind of man who appreciated being correct about things. Hades Hive held for 6 months. Every assault, every wave. Ghazghkull threw his forces at those defenses continuously, and Yarrick countered each push from the front line. Not from a command post, not from a bunker, but in the fighting. Visible to his own soldiers and to the Orks, surrounded by green-skinned dead. When Ghazghkull finally sent his war boss Uglhard to personally break the outer defenses, Yarrick stepped forward to challenge him. Uglhard severed Yarrick's right arm at the elbow with a single strike from his power claw. Yarrick, with one arm and an injury that should have ended the fight and then ended him, beheaded the war boss with his chainsword. Then he pulled the power claw from the corpse and held it above his head. The sight broke the Ork assault. Only after the greenskins fled did Yarrick allow himself to pass out from blood loss. He had the power claw fitted as a replacement arm, not a standard Imperial prosthetic, the actual weapon that had just taken his arm, attached to the stump where his arm used to be. That choice was deliberate. Yarrick understood that Orks respect displayed strength and are deeply superstitious about trophies and the symbols of kills. A human who takes the weapon of a war boss he personally decapitated and wears it on his body is communicating something specific in the Ork cultural register. Then, when rumors spread among the Ork forces that Yarrick could kill with a look, he had his replacement eye engineered to fire a laser beam. He found out what the Orks believed about him and modified his body to make it literally true. Golgotha, 944 M41. 3 years after Armageddon, Yarrick pursued Ghazghkull across space. Ghazghkull captured him, subjected him to torture and forced labor, and Yarrick organized a slave revolt aboard Ghazghkull's space hulk that ultimately failed. He was brought before Ghazghkull in chains. Ghazghkull gave him a shuttle and let him go. His stated reason being that good enemies were hard to find, and that the next invasion of Armageddon would be better with Yarrick on the other side. Orks don't release defeated enemies. That isn't a thing Orks do. The explanation that fits the behavior is that Ghazghkull doesn't believe Yarrick can be permanently defeated, so killing him would waste the opportunity. In the Era Indomitus, Yarrick was officially declared dead. The Bell of Lost Souls on Terra was tolled for him. He was subsequently found alive in the medical bays of a Space Wolves strike cruiser, undergoing cybernetic reconstruction. The mechanism had taken another shot at him. The mechanism had, again, declined to finish. Ghazghkul's documented words on Yarrick. "Humies is all weak scum dat deserve to get stomped, 'cept for One-Eye Yarrick. He knows how to fight." No explicit statement about immortality anywhere in the record. The evidence is entirely behavioral. But the behavior is consistent across 6 decades of documented encounters, and it rhymes with one specific pattern. An orc who treats a human opponent as something that can't be permanently removed from the equation. Yarrick's own words from his memoir. "They were letting me go because I had lived up to my legend. I would do more than that when they came again." That is a man who looked at the mechanism, recognized it, and made a deliberate promise to himself about how he would continue feeding it. The legend is the weapon. He holds it consciously, shapes it strategically, and sharpens it with every decision about how his body looks, how his eye functions, and how he speaks in front of both armies. That is the baseline. That is the control variable. Now meet the experiment. The WAAAGH-field isn't one orc's achievement. It's a collective psychic gestalt generated continuously by every orc alive, all the time, scaling with orc population. More orcs in one location means a proportionally stronger field. Its documented effects include making orc technology function despite being technically non-viable. Their guns operate because enough orcs believe they should. Their vehicles achieve speeds that conventional physics can't account for because the field reinforces what orcs expect. Red vehicles empirically move faster in orc-held territory. Yellow weapons empirically hit harder. These aren't metaphors. They are recorded mechanical effects of collective belief bending physical reality. The field is also not purely an internal orc phenomenon. During the War of the Beast, one of the most catastrophic orc invasions in Imperial history, coordinated Space Marine librarians, trained psychic warriors, were overwhelmed by direct WAAAGH-field exposure. Human psychers can be affected by it. The field reshapes reality, and humans exist in reality. Whether it extends to physically sustaining human life in orc territory is the contested inference. The honest position is that it's unconfirmed as a direct mechanism, strongly suggested by one documented case study, and we're about to examine what happens when a second case study enters the record, one that should rule out several alternative explanations for the first. Weird boys. Orc psychers function as focusing lenses for the collective field. They channel what all orcs generate passively and direct it with purpose. A weird boy's individual power comes not from personal psychic strength, but from acting as a conduit for the ambient WAAAGH energy of every orc in proximity. Ghazghkul, as the great prophet of Gork and Mork, arguably functions in a similar role when he personally invests belief in a specific outcome. His conviction about Yarrick isn't just one orc's opinion, it's the focused belief of a WAAAGH-scale prophet directing the field toward a specific result. Yarrick's case could therefore be explained as focused WAAAGH belief. One extraordinarily powerful orc acting as a psychic lens, directing centuries of accumulated conviction toward one human's continued survival. If that's the complete explanation, Yarrick is a unique case, and the mechanism requires a named orc prophet to function. Cain has no named orc prophet. Commissar Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium. Full title, Bureaucratic designation, not a personal assertion. His private memoirs, compiled, organized, and published within inquisitorial circles by Ordo Xenos Inquisitor Amberly Vale after his death, open with Amberly's introduction, which begins, "Some of my fellow inquisitors may be shocked to discover that one of the Imperium's most venerated heroes was, by his own admission, a scoundrel and a self-seeking rogue. A fact of which, due to our sporadic personal association, I have long been aware. Indeed, I would go so far as to contend that it was this very combination of character flaws which made him one of the most effective servants the Imperium has ever had, despite his strenuous efforts to the contrary. Despite his strenuous efforts to the contrary is doing enormous structural work in that sentence, and Amberly knows it. She isn't a casual observer. An Ordo-Xenos Inquisitor has full access to Imperial military records, combat reports, casualty documentation, and independent campaign histories. She cross-referenced Cain's private archive against the published memoirs of General Genet Sula, against Departamento Munitorum casualty records, against every independent source her classification level could access. Her conclusion was that Cain's self-assessment as a coward is genuine and accurate, and so is his record as one of the most effective Imperial servants of the late 41st millennium, and both things are simultaneously, uncomplicatedly true. The gap between them is the running joke of the novel series. It's also the philosophical problem at the center of this argument. Cain wrote the memoirs with no intention of publication. He apparently expected that whatever Inquisitor found the archive would destroy it. Amberley describes the document as a single data slate stuffed with files arranged with a cavalier disregard for chronology and no indexing scheme she could identify after prolonged examination. It's a man's private attempt to make sense of a career he didn't choose and couldn't escape. His own summary of his tactical philosophy appears as a verse in the early memoir sections. When in deadly danger, when beset by doubt, run in little circles, wave your arms, and shout. That is the internal reality. That is what the mechanism is working with. He began his service in 919 M41, attached to the Valhallan 12th Field Artillery. His career ambition was specific and sincere, a lifetime of rear echelon obscurity. Artillery was perfect for this. Sit half a continent away from the enemy, provide fire support at range, survive. He had a plan. His first battle was on Desolatia 4, against Orks. The regiment had been holding defensive positions against an Ork assault when a Tyrannid splinter fleet arrived and the situation became considerably more complicated. Cain, faced with a deteriorating front line and what he assessed as an entirely unwinnable tactical situation, made a decision that was, in his own account, an attempt at outright desertion. He commandeered a Salamander scout vehicle and drove it away from the fighting toward what he judged to be safety. He drove directly into a Tyrannid flanking force that had not yet been detected by Imperial command, including a Hive tyrant. His panicked contact report, transmitted back to headquarters while he retreated at maximum speed, was recorded in official Imperial records as a heroically successful forward scouting mission and deliberate baiting maneuver that had successfully exposed the flanking threat. The Valhallan 12th received actionable intelligence. Cain received a reputation for exceptional situational awareness and personal courage. He had been a Commissar for approximately 5 minutes. This is the Cain loop in its first iteration, and it repeated without significant variation for the next century plus. He sought safety. Safety was already occupied by the worst available thing. His panic-driven reaction to the worst thing was interpreted by every observer as tactical brilliance. His legend expanded. More dangerous assignments followed because that's what legends generate. He sought safety in those as well. On Slockenberg, a chaos sorceress nearly possessed him and 2 artillerists before Jurgen's null field broke her connection. On Castifor, Orks specifically, the 597th Valhallan deployed to suppress a greenskin infestation, and Cain present and nominally commanding. On Simia Orichalke, Orks on the surface again, and a Necron tomb complex beneath the ice in the tunnels Cain was sent to investigate. He survived these campaigns by keeping his head down and was, his own records note, commonly the only survivor of whatever group he found himself attached to. He subsequently requested transfer back to full regimental duty because roving specialist posting was proving more dangerous than frontline regimental service, which isn't how specialist postings are supposed to work. He joined the 597th Valhallan in 931 M41, a regiment that was itself partly his creation, formed from the amalgamation of the battered 296th and 301st Valhallan regiments, redesignated the 597th to reflect their combined origins. He built it into a coherent fighting force, became genuinely popular with its soldiers, and spent the next 15 years attempting, with great sincerity and no success, to avoid being deployed anywhere of strategic significance. In 924 M41, before the 597th, during his time with the 12th, Cain's transport ship engaged Ork attackers in orbit over Perlia. The engagement went badly. He and his aide Jurgen evacuated in a savior pod that was struck during the fighting and crashed behind Ork lines on the surface. Imperial records listed both of them as presumed dead. This was the entirely reasonable conclusion of everyone with access to the situation report. Perlia at that point was under active Ork occupation. Not a raid, not a border skirmish. A full planetary invasion, with an Ork warlord commanding organized forces across multiple continents. The interior was Ork territory. A single Imperial Commissar and his aide, without regiment or support, in the middle of it, with no line of communication to Imperial forces on the other side. The administrative outcome was obvious. The paperwork was filed. What the paperwork didn't anticipate is that Cain is extraordinarily difficult to kill in the specific way that involves enemies actually succeeding. He and Jurgen landed with only the supplies aboard the pod and no tactical objective beyond survival. Within days, they encountered an Ork labor camp where human civilians were being worked under armed greenskins' supervision. Cain freed them. His reasoning, per the memoirs, was that the camp was between him and the direction he needed to travel. The liberated slaves represented potential assistance in navigating Ork territory, and Orks guarding a labor camp are Orks who are occupied and not hunting him. This isn't heroism. This is a man doing survival arithmetic with whatever variables are available. The freed slaves became the core of the column that history would call Cain's heroes. Liberated civilians, PDF survivors, an administratum scrivener named Norbert pressed into logistics duty, an engineer named Felicia Tabor and her brother Alaric from the Perlian PDF. They moved through Ork-occupied territory for weeks. They scrounged weapons from abandoned Ork positions and ambushed isolated Ork patrols that were individually weaker than the assembled force. Cain navigated all of this through what the memoirs describe as his long-practiced instinct for survival calculation and an extensive personal familiarity with underground passages, a skill he'd refined across every hive city, tunnel complex, and Necron crypt the galaxy had dropped him into. In the Valley of Demons on Perlia's eastern continent, a massed Ork force converged on their position. Thousands of Orks. No possibility of fighting through them directly. No Imperial lines close enough to reach on foot. Cain destroyed the valley's hydroelectric dam. The flood killed the Ork force. He then located the Ork warlord commanding the planetary invasion and killed him personally. The Imperial forces fighting a conventional campaign on the other side of the Ork lines found the entire enemy command structure suddenly in disarray. The warlord dead, secondary command collapsed. Reserve forces that had been redirected to hunt something in the occupied interior, now redirected from the front. The counterattack succeeded. Perlia was liberated. In his own assessment, what he had done was make enough of a fuss that the Orks had to divert a lot of Ork power for an army that doesn't even exist. He emerged from the Ork lines at the head of a column of freed slaves and surviving soldiers that history designated the March of the Liberator. He received the Star of Terra for his actions on Perlia, the second highest military honor the Imperium bestows. He didn't want the Star of Terra. He wanted Tana T, which he hadn't had in weeks. Both details appear in the available records. The planet he accidentally liberated eventually became his retirement home. He returned to Perlia in 999 M41, 75 years after the March of the Liberator, to teach at the Schola Progenium there, and was immediately dragged into the defense of the planet against Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. He was over 200 years old at this point. The galaxy had not finished with him. Between Perlia and that retirement, the Ork thread continued. Castifor in 937 M41, then Nusquam Fundamentibus in 942 M41, where he was specifically deployed to suppress an Ork outbreak. His transport crashed en route through the warp, and he and Jurgen spent extended time surviving against Ork patrols in the ice wilderness before regrouping with the 597th, at which point they discovered a hibernating Tyranid swarm beneath the ice and had to trigger a volcanic eruption to destroy it before it could fully awaken. That is a standard deployment for him. The 2023 anthology collection includes a short story titled The Only Good Ork, a dedicated Cain versus Ork encounter whose full contents fall outside available secondary records, but whose existence confirms that the Ork thread through his career warranted its own standalone treatment across the full series. At some point, someone in the Departamento Munitorum had to make a decision. The decision was forced by repetition. Cain had been listed killed in action during the Perlia orbital engagement. Reasonable, given the circumstances. Paperwork filed. Then he came back. The records had to be corrected. Then something similar happened in a subsequent campaign. Then again, in a different one. Each time, Administratum Adepts filed the appropriate death documentation, updated the casualty records, and then received new information indicating that the Commissar wasn't dead. The records had to be corrected again. The precedent updated. The death unentered. The formal solution was a standing order issued specifically for Cain's file. He was to be maintained on the active roster at all times, regardless of whatever field reports anyone submitted to the contrary. Any report of his death was to be treated as unconfirmed until further notice. The order had no expiration date. It survived his actual retirement to the Schola Progenium on Perlia. It survived his recall to active duty during the 13th Black Crusade, while he was over 200 years old. It survived his state funeral in the Era Indomitus, after which he was buried with full military honors. He received an official state funeral. He has a grave. He is, officially, still on active duty. The Imperium of Man administers approximately 1 million worlds and processes millions of military casualties per campaign season. The Departamento Munitorum does not, as a rule, issue standing orders exempting specific commissars from standard death filing procedure. The paperwork is vast and entrenched. For Cain specifically, they decided the paperwork was probably wrong, and they encoded that decision into permanent policy with no sunset clause. The bureaucratic record isn't fan fiction. It isn't a story embellishment. It's documented in the canonical material as a real administrative action taken by a real imperial institution in response to a real pattern they couldn't otherwise account for. The Imperium gave him a funeral and a grave, and simultaneously refused to file him as dead. Both things are currently true at the same time. The Departamento Munitorum, after careful consideration, decided that the most administratively responsible position on Ciaphas Cain was to assume he was always still alive until physically demonstrated otherwise, because that had repeatedly been the accurate position. Here is what the Orks on Perlia experienced in 924 M41 from the outside. A human appeared in the interior of their occupied territory. No regiment, no supply line, no tactical support. This human freed their labor force, recruited those freed humans and surviving planetary PDF into a fighting unit that operated in their territory for weeks without being destroyed, demolished a major piece of Ork-controlled infrastructure at precisely the moment it would inflict maximum casualties on a massed Ork force, and then killed the warlord in personal combat. Ork culture operates entirely on the principle that strength is real and weakness isn't. The strong lead. The stronger lead more. An orc who kills a war boss is respected for it. A human who kills a warlord and walks out of occupied territory afterward is communicating something in the orc register that doesn't have a clean translation, but has a clear meaning. This one does not die easily. The orcs on Perlia wouldn't have known Cain's name. They may not have had a coherent category for what he represented. But orc lore propagates through the collective psychic field the same way everything in orc culture propagates, through combat experience, through story, through the communal weight of shared awareness. The account of the human in the Valley of Demons would have circulated. Every orc who survived Perlia and later told another orc about it contributed to a growing collective perception. Every retelling made the story slightly larger, the way orc stories do. By the time Cain returned to a different ice world in 942 M41 to fight a different orc force, there were orcs alive who had heard about the March of the Liberator. He then went back to Perlia in 999 M41 to live there. The world he accidentally liberated, the world where his orc legend began, the world where orc oral tradition had been carrying the story of the Valley of Demons for 75 years. That's where he chose to spend his retirement. Whatever the local orc population retained about what happened there, Cain was now living in the middle of it. This is the segment that settles the argument. Methodical approach required. Sebastian Yarrick's relationship to his own legend is documented in direct primary text. When Ghazghkull released him at Golgotha, his internal response from his own memoir was, "They were letting me go because I had lived up to my legend. I would do more than that when they came again." He doesn't express relief. He doesn't express confusion about Ghazghkull's motives. He identifies the mechanism in operation, accepts it as a functioning tool, and commits to expanding it. The legend is a weapon, and he is consciously sharpening it in the same breath as he describes surviving. Every element of Yarrick's physical appearance is calculated for orc psychological consumption. The power claw is on his arm as a permanent display of the kill it represents. The Baal Eye fires a laser because orcs said he could kill with a look, and Yarrick engineered himself to make that belief true. He learned the orc language decades before the Second War for Armageddon, so he could follow orc battle cries in real time and know how to respond. When he addresses his troops, "Heroes of Armageddon, you have withstood the evil savagery of the orcs, and they have nothing left for you to fear. So raise high the black banners of vengeance. Now it's our time." He is performing the legend for human and orc consumption simultaneously. The performance is continuous, deliberate, and without ambivalence. He didn't stumble into the myth. He built it, component by component, across 6 decades of active war. And he understood exactly what he was building and why. Cain's relationship to his own legend is documented in approximately 800 pages of private memoirs that he wrote specifically to explain why the legend is wrong about him. His official public memoir, titled "To Serve the Emperor, a Commissar's Life," is the performance version, the one that maintains the heroic framing for general consumption. Amberley describes it as comparatively poorly written relative to the private archive, and not nearly as candid. The private Cain, the one without the performance, states clearly and with specificity that his reputation for courage was, in his own framing, the death of him. Not a tool, a threat. Every increase in his heroic profile generated a more dangerous subsequent posting, which required maintaining the profile to avoid being shot for cowardice, which generated further dangerous postings. He understood the loop. He was trapped in it. He documented his entrapment in writing, his tactical philosophy in verse. When in deadly danger, when beset by doubt, run in little circles, wave your arms and shout. This isn't a man performing indomitable resolve. This is a man describing his actual response to crisis and finding it embarrassing enough to put in verse rather than confront directly. Where Yarrick stepped forward to personally challenge Ugelhard in single combat after losing his arm, Cain's consistent preference was the sewer. His memoirs contain a specific observation, noted as a genuine grievance, that having sewers and storm drains as convenient escape routes whenever he was trapped in a building surrounded by orcs wasn't nearly as common as he would have liked. He had noticed the pattern. He had assessed it as a tactical deficiency in urban planning. He had a specific preference, and it was underground water infrastructure. Yarrick designs his prosthetics for psychological warfare against alien opponents. Cain catalogs the adequacy of urban drainage systems in occupied territory. These are the same rank, the same species, the same Commissar designation, operating in the same universe against some of the same enemies. They aren't the same person by any other available measure. Now place both of them against the mechanism. If WAAAGH-field immortality were merit-based, if it required the subject to earn orc respect through deliberate performance, to consciously construct a legend within the orc cultural register, to feed the field with intention, it would function for Yarrick and fail entirely for Cain. Yarrick is the performance. He engineered himself for it. Cain is a man whose internal monologue during every engagement is a variation of, "Please, Emperor, just let me survive this, and I will never do anything interesting again." He does not know what orcs believe about him. He would find the information actively distressing. The Desolatia incident. Cain attempted desertion, drove into a Tyranid flanking force, and his panicked retreat was recorded as heroic scouting. The orcs on Desolatia, whatever they understood of that battle, observed a Commissar who appeared to operate effectively under catastrophic pressure and survive contact with both greenskins and Tyranids simultaneously. They didn't have access to his internal monologue. They had the outcome. The outcome said, "This one does not die easily." Perlia. Cain's stated objective was his own survival. His stated method was improvisation under pressure. His stated reaction to receiving the Star of Terra wasn't preserved in available records, but his subsequent behavior, actively seeking quiet postings, accepting dangerous ones only when the alternative was execution, is entirely consistent with a man who was horrified by the attention. The orc warlord he killed in the Valley of Demons died because Cain needed the orc warlord to not be commanding the planetary invasion anymore, and the method of achieving that was direct combat. From inside his perspective, this was desperate calculation. From outside, from the perspective of orc survivors carrying the story through the WAAAGH-field, it was a human who crashed into their war zone and killed their commander personally. Amberly Vale, his editor and the person with deepest access to both his private self-assessment and his official record, describes him as overly modest in recording his victories against the enemies of the Imperium. She has the independent documentation. Her conclusion is that Cain's private self-accounting understates his actual accomplishments. The man has imposter syndrome, severe enough that a trained inquisitor with full record access has to annotate his memoirs to correct his self-underestimation. The orcs don't have the footnotes. They have the outcomes. Yarrick proves the mechanism can exist. Cain proves it's automatic. Yarrick collaborated with it consciously, fed it deliberately, and understood what he was building. Cain doesn't know it's running. The mechanism is fine with that. It doesn't require his cooperation. It requires orc belief. And orc belief is responding to the outcomes, not to whatever the Commissar privately thinks about them. The cleanest objection to the Cain case is Ferric Jurgen. Jurgen is Cain's aide throughout the novel series. He is also, critically, a blank, a psychic null, an untouchable, an individual whose presence generates a field that suppresses psychic activity in his immediate vicinity. On Gravelax, the Gene-Stealer Patriarch couldn't directly affect Cain because Jurgen was standing nearby. On Slockenberg, the Chaos Sorceress lost her connection to Cain when Jurgen intervened. His null field is the most reliable counter in Cain's toolkit. deployed simply by Jurgen existing in the same location. Jurgen is present for the Death or Glory campaign on Perlia. They crashed together, survived together, operated together for weeks in Ork-occupied territory. The single most concentrated Ork engagement of Cain's career, and his psychic null aid was there throughout. The argument follows directly. Jurgen is why Cain survives Ork territory. His blank field suppresses the WAAAGH-field's effects in Cain's immediate vicinity. No WAAAGH-field immortality required. Conventional psychic suppression is sufficient. The problem with this argument is the scale of what it's trying to explain. The WAAAGH-field's power scales directly with Ork population density. More Orks in one location means a proportionally stronger field. On Perlia, Cain operated for weeks inside territory occupied by thousands of Orks conducting an active planetary invasion. Not a patrol, not a local garrison, a full-scale war zone with an Ork warlord commanding organized forces across a continent. The WAAAGH energy present in that environment operated at a scale incomparable to a single Genestealer Patriarch or one Chaos Sorceress. Jurgen's null field suppresses psychic activity within his immediate presence. It does not extend across a continent. When Cain was moving through Ork-held territory, when the Ork warlord was maneuvering forces on the other side of the valley, Jurgen's field wasn't covering that distance. The collective WAAAGH field, generated by thousands of Orks occupying an entire landmass, does not switch off because one blank is somewhere on that landmass. The Jurgen explanation accounts for close-range psychic threats, direct attacks, psychic confrontations, the kind of focused alien or chaos ability that has a specific point of origin. It does not account for ambient WAAAGH field saturation across a war zone. It doesn't account for the administrative anomaly, the career-long pattern of KIA listings and returns that predates some of Cain's time with Jurgen. It doesn't account for a Departmentum Unitorum standing order that arose from a pattern the bureaucracy noticed across multiple campaigns and couldn't explain through any available mechanism. Jurgen is a partial answer to a question that is larger than what one blank covers. There is a detail buried in the character records of the Traitor's Hand campaign on Adumbria in 937 M41 that is easy to miss and impossible to ignore once you've found it. Deployed alongside the 597th Valhallan was the Talarn 229th Regiment, including a sergeant named Alem Mahat, assigned to Commissar Tomas Beja, an old rival of Cain's from the Schola Progenium. Beja sent Mahat to arrest Cain for leaving his post without authorization to pursue a tactical objective Beja hadn't sanctioned. Mahat ended up fighting alongside Cain instead. The campaign concluded. Mahat survived. Alem Mahat subsequently wrote a text. That text is now called the Book of Cain. It's venerated by a sect on Talarn as Holy Scripture. The sect believes that Commissar Ciaphas Cain is a prophet of the Emperor and a conduit of his divine will. A religious cult formed around a man who describes himself, in private and at length, as a fraud. The galaxy hasn't asked for Cain's endorsement at any stage of this process. The Orks aren't filing for his cooperation before adding to the WAAAGH field perception. The Talarn aren't requesting his spiritual authorization before writing scripture. The Departmentum Unitorum didn't ask him whether he wanted the standing order. Every layer of the structure apparently sustaining him has done so without consultation, without his knowledge, and in the Talarn case, in direct contradiction of his stated self-assessment. Amberly Vale is an Ordo Xenos Inquisitor. Her professional mandate is alien threats to humanity. Her interest in Cain is therefore not only personal, a human who repeatedly survives contact with alien forces through mechanisms that may involve alien psychic fields operating in his favor is precisely the kind of anomaly an Ordo Xenos operative would need to understand and document. She compiled his memoirs after his death, published them within inquisitorial circles only, and had them sequestered by order of the Holy Ordos. The Cain archive isn't public. It's restricted to Inquisition access. An inquisitor who spent decades as Cain's close associate, professionally and personally, and then spent additional years after his death organizing, annotating, and classifying his private records at the highest restriction level available, is someone who has a specific operational theory about what he was. She didn't archive him for sentiment. She archived him because the archive is evidence of something she wants her colleagues equipped to evaluate. Cain died in the early era Indomitus. State funeral. Buried on Perlia, the world he accidentally liberated, the world he retired to, the world where his orc legend was born. His grave is on the planet where the WAAAGH-field perception of him originated and has been accumulating for the better part of a century. The Departamento Munitorum still has him on active duty. Living saints in imperial theology are individuals so thoroughly infused with divine will, or so saturated with the accumulated faith of millions of believers, that their physical form becomes something other than purely mortal. They die, and the belief concentrated around them reasserts their existence. The mechanism doesn't require the saint's active cooperation. It requires belief in sufficient quantity, directed at sufficient intensity, toward the right target. WAAAGH-field immortality, if it operates as described, is structurally the same process from a different source. Collective belief in sufficient quantity bending physical reality around one specific human being. One mechanism runs on imperial faith. The other runs on orc psychic gestalt. Both are, at the mechanical level, collective belief producing physical consequences in one person's vicinity. Cain has both running simultaneously. The Book of Cain exists. The Talarn sect venerates him. Imperial soldiers across a dozen campaigns described him as a hero and believed it sincerely, regardless of what he privately wrote. The orcs who survived Perlia have been carrying the story of the Valley of Demons through the WAAAGH-field for 8 decades. An Ordo Xenos inquisitor chose to preserve rather than destroy his archive. The canon doesn't confirm what this combination ultimately produces. It gives us a dead commissar, a state funeral, active duty paperwork, and a specialist inquisitor who classified his records at maximum restriction instead of destroying them. The open question is left open deliberately, and it's left open because the honest position is that we don't know. But the pieces are arranged in a specific way, and the arrangement suggests someone should probably check whether that grave on Perlia has anyone in it. Yarrick has Ghazghkull. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka isn't simply a powerful orc. He is the great prophet of Gork and Mork, the most significant orc warlord of the current era, an individual who functions as a focal point for WAAAGH energy the way a weird boy channels the collective field. His personal, named, decades-long investment in Yarrick's survival is the most specific element of the Yarrick case. He believes in Yarrick, specifically, individually, persistently, across 60 years and multiple wars. When Ghazghkull chooses to let Yarrick live at Golgotha, that isn't one orc's casual decision. That is a WAAAGH prophet focusing his conviction on one outcome. Cain, across 11 novels, 14 short stories, and 2 audio dramas, has no named recurring orc antagonist. The warlord he killed on Perlia has no name that survives in the available record. No orc warlord tracks him across multiple campaigns. No named orc prophet emerges to serve as his Ghazghkull. 2 possible explanations, and they lead in completely different directions. The first, a named orc prophet of Cain exists somewhere in the primary texts, possibly in the Only Good Orc, possibly in a campaign encounter not fully cataloged in available secondary material. An orc with a name, a specific relationship to Cain's legend, a persistent conviction about the human who keeps not dying. If you've read that story and there's a character who fits, that is the Ghazghkull equivalent. That is focused WAAAGH belief. Same mechanism as Yarrick's, lower profile focal point. The second, no such orc exists. Cain's version of the effect runs on entirely anonymous, collective, distributed orc belief. Not one prophet, thousands of orcs, across multiple war zones, across multiple decades, each contributing a fractional increment to a cumulative collective perception, the human who can't be stopped. Every orc who survived Perlia and told the story, every orc on Castafor who encountered him and failed to resolve the encounter in the standard way, every orc on Nusquam Fundamentibus who crossed his path and didn't kill him, each one, anonymously, without intention, without coordination, maintaining the effect by simply believing what the outcomes told them. This second version is structurally more unsettling than Yarrick's case, not less. Yarrick's mechanism has a single focal point. Eliminate Gazgul, theoretically, somehow, and you break the specific circuit. There is one prophet and one concentration of belief. Cain's version, if it runs on distributed anonymous consensus, has no circuit to break. No single orc is responsible for it. No individual orc is even aware they're participating in it. The belief self-sustains because survival events keep generating new believers. Every time Cain survives something that should have killed him, the collective orc awareness of the pattern grows slightly stronger, which makes the field around him slightly more supportive, which produces another survival event, which produces more awareness. The loop runs without a controller, without a prophet, without anyone at the center who knows it's happening, including Cain himself. He would find this information absolutely horrifying. The mechanism isn't waiting for his cooperation. It's running fine without him. The orcs aren't doing this deliberately. They are simply noticing that something keeps not dying, and they respect it because that is what orcs do. Somewhere in that anonymous collective respect, the WAAAGH-field is quietly doing what it always does, making belief real. And Ciaphas Cain, hero of the Imperium, self-described fraud, man who wanted a lifetime of rear echelon obscurity, is the thing it has decided to make real with. Tell us in the comments whether you've read The Only Good Orc, and whether there's a named orc in it who matters. That answer changes the entire closing calculation, and if the answer is yes, there's a third video to write. Subscribe for more stories like this.